The DJI O4 Air unit has released, and a whole lot of YouTubers, including myself, are making a whole lot of content about it. In this video, I want to go through your top questions about the O4 Air unit. And I say your top questions. Actually, I put on my YouTube channel a survey and said, what questions do you have about it that you feel like aren't being answered? And, well, I wrote them all down. And I'm going to answer, not all of them, but almost all of them. I'm Joshua Bardwell. You're going to learn something today. I want to start by saying that if you've got a specific question, I encourage you to go down to the video description below and take a look. I've got a list of all of the questions as well as timestamps as to where I answered that question. And if you do have a specific question and don't want to just sit through the whole video, go down there and find it and get the answers that you need. But there's a whole lot of interesting information in here that maybe some of it you didn't pick up from the reviews, or maybe some of it you just wasn't in the reviews. So let's get into it. And we're going to start off with a general question asking, what setup should I buy? Like, let's assume that I don't already have a DJI goggles or a DJI Air unit. I'm not invested. I want to go with the DJI system. And what I really want to know is, can I buy the DJI N3 goggles, or do I need to spend more on something like the Goggles 3 or maybe the Integra or the Goggles 2? Now, the DJI N3 goggles are $229 new, whereas the Goggles 3 are $499 new. So there's a significant savings if you can go with the N3 and get an equally good experience. And the good news is that in some ways you can. The good news is that the N3 goggles support all of the same features and capabilities as the Goggles 3. The major downside of the N3 goggles in terms of performance is that they are higher latency. And the exact difference in latency depends on which frame rate you're using, whether you're using racing mode or not. But for perspective, with the Goggles 3, DJI announces a 24 millisecond latency with the Avata 2 compared to a 31 millisecond latency for the N3 goggles. So the N3 goggles are going to have slightly higher latency, but what about their range? And I'm not aware of a detailed range test between the two goggles, and in fact, I haven't done one either. I'm working on that, just haven't gotten to it yet. However, DJI does give the exact same maximum transmission distance of 13 kilometers for both of those goggles, which suggests that, at least from DJI's perspective, they should have about the same performance. Other than latency, the main thing you give up with the DJI Goggles N3 is size. They are significantly bigger than the DJI Goggles 3, and maybe you care about that and maybe you don't. They're certainly not unwieldy large. They're a little bit smaller even than the V2 goggles, which many people love. The screens on the N3 are 60 Hz LCD screens instead of 100 Hz OLED screens on the Goggle 3, so they're not going to look quite as nice if you like the brightness and saturation of an OLED screen, but they look pretty nice. And it's not a binocular goggle with two screens, one for each eye. It's a single big LCD panel with a mirror bouncing it into your face. You don't have adjustable focus on the N3 for people who wear glasses, so you will be wearing your glasses inside the goggles, or maybe somebody makes custom diopters, although I'm not aware of anybody doing that for those goggles at this time. Based on all that, which one should you buy? And of course, it's going to depend on the value of your money. If you're the kind of person who doesn't care about spending $300 more for the Goggles 3, definitely do it. The OLED screens are very nice, the smaller size is very nice, and the ability to have access to the lowest possible latency is also very nice. The DJI system already has higher latency than some pilots would prefer, so you don't want to add a little bit more on top of that by using a goggle with only a 60 Hz screen. But for a lot of people, $300 is a lot to ask, and the N3 is very compelling. No, you won't get the lowest possible latency, and some would argue that if you're going to go with the O4 system, that racing mode with the lower latency is one of the big advantages. Yes, the O4 has better range and penetration than the O3. That's true. Yes, the O4 will give you access to the O4 Lite video transmitter, which is really good for smaller micro builds. I'm talking myself back around to saying that the N3 is still a very compelling choice, even if you don't care about the latency of the racing mode and the 60 megabit per second. But those are the things you're giving up if you go with the N3. And if you're asking, what about the Integra? The Integra goggles are also available for around $200, maybe on the used market. I think new, they're still closer to $300 to $350. But people are seeing used Integra goggles for around $200 and saying, shouldn't I get that instead of the N3? Between the Integra and the N3, I think I would take the N3 and get the full advantage of the O4 system and not buy a goggle that's already one generation out of date And then when the O5 comes out, presumably the Integra is not going to be supported, but presumably the G3 and the N3 would. So I just feel like between the Integra and the N3 is the one to get today. What if you've already got a Goggles 2 or an Integra and you're interested in upgrading? Is it worth the money? And once again, that just depends on how much your money is worth to you. But here's my thoughts about it. If you've got an Integra and you can find somebody to sell it to for the price of an N3, I think that's a worthy upgrade. If possible, you should try an N3 on, because if you've gotten used to the goggle experience of the Integra, the N3 is a box goggle experience, and especially if you don't have perfect vision, you're going to be wearing your glasses inside the N3, and maybe that's a deal breaker for you. But it's going to get you to the O4 generation, and it's probably going to be about a break even in terms of price. If you've got the Goggles 2, is it a downgrade to go to the N3? In terms of their actual performance, the Goggles 2 are not that different from the Integra. One of the main things that's missing with the Integra is the adjustable focus of the Goggles 2. So once again, if you're a glasses wearer, take that into account. But I think with even going from the Goggles 2 to the N3 is probably the move if you're interested in starting to use the O4 Air units. Going from the Goggles 2 to the Goggles 3, that's a little bit tougher because you're going to be laying out money, and I think it depends heavily on how much you want the features of the O4, the racing mode and the 60 megabit per second and the best possible range and penetration, versus how much you can get for the Goggles 2 and how much extra you're going to lay out to get the Goggles 3. Now, I've been saying that the Goggles 2 and the Integra, the older generation of goggles, don't have racing mode and don't have 60 megabit per second bitrate. And some people ask, well, maybe they'll get it in a firmware update. Obviously, I can't know what DJI will and won't do in the future. But just from a marketing perspective, I don't see them doing that. Like, the way that DJI typically operates is the next generation has basic backwards compatibility with the previous generation, but then the next generation has some new features and performance that makes you want to upgrade, and that's how they get you on the treadmill. So why would they do that? That would just disincentivize you from upgrading, which is what they want you to do. In addition, I think it's probable that there are some technical reasons why you're not getting the full performance out of those older, like they have a slower processor or something. And it's possible that there may be technical reasons why racing mode and 60 megabit per second are just not feasible on those older generation of goggles. So my money would be that they're not going to get it. I've been talking about this racing mode, and it's kind of a big deal because traditionally DJI has been very bad for racing for various reasons. Can we sum up racing mode? Yes, we can. Racing mode offers lower and more consistent latency. Latency as low as 15 milliseconds with the Goggles 3, or about 20 milliseconds, I think maybe 22 milliseconds is what Chris Rosser measured with the N3 goggles. That latency is lower and it is more consistent, but it is not a fixed latency. As you fly, that latency will fluctuate. And there's no way to measure that latency while we're in flight, and DJI doesn't report it, but subjectively, I believe that the latency is more consistent in racing mode than it is in non-racing mode. It is definitely lower. We can verify that on the bench. When you're in racing mode, you are locked to 1080p at 100 frames per second and 4:3. And no, you can't record 4K on the Air unit, but get 1080p back to the goggles. It's just 1080p 100 and that's it. The bitrate maxes out around 20 megabits per second, and that will fluctuate and go down as you fly depending on the obstacles, the distance, and the output power. Under normal racing conditions, I've seen it fluctuate between about 15 and 18 megabits per second, starting at 20 megabits per second when you're on the block, and then as you're flying out and there's interference and the quad's flying around, it goes down a little bit. When you're in racing mode, auto channel selection and auto channel scanning is disabled. You manually set your channel and the DJI system stays on that channel. And most importantly, the telemetry packets that the older system would transmit all over the band are constrained within the channel. What that means is that the thing that happened with the Goggles 2, the Integra, and the O3, where whenever you were powered up, you were spamming the entire frequency band and everybody was like, sure, unplug your system, DJI, stupid DJI users. And all the DJI users had to be put into a heat all by themselves because they were pariahs. That doesn't happen with the O4. And I can tell you, I've proved that not just in a spectrum analyzer, but I worked on a video this week with Evan Turner and the guys over at 533, where they flew some race heats with me and we did a whole bunch of testing. That's in editing right now. I'm sorry it hasn't released yet, but look forward to that. When you're in racing mode, you have 8 channels, and those channels do match exactly the raceband frequencies that are typically used. And the output power of the O4 system, when it's put in manual mode, it can be in auto mode and it does its own thing, but when it's in manual mode, it is locked at that output power and does not fluctuate. And there's the ability to adjust the output power up and down to fine-tune it to match the threshold that your race director is using. So it is very compatible with timing systems, as compatible as HD0 or analog, which is all of which is to say that, yeah, you'll sometimes get a missed lap or sometimes you'll get a double lap or something, but that's just because of lap timing being the way lap timing is and not some weird quirk with the DJI system. So technically speaking, the DJI O4 system in racing mode is like usable for racing. You can show up at a race and you're not going to spam everybody with interference and you're not going to screw with the timing system, etc., etc. But is it like actually usable for racing? And I can tell you that the latency is not as low as the best analog systems. It is not as low as the best HD0 systems by far, and it is not as consistent. But even a pilot like Evan Turner, who flew it, said it felt really good. And in fact, he was so excited by the test that we did, he actually put an O4 into one of his race drones to continue testing it out. In addition, he ran laps. He ran hot laps with HD0 and the O4. And I don't want to spoil the result, but let's just say the O4 held its own. So is O4 viable for racing? I don't think O4 will ever be the first choice of racers, because the top racers will always want a fixed latency and the absolute lowest latency system. But if you are a DJI pilot who's always kind of wished you could go racing, but never really felt like you had the option, I think the racing mode in the O4 and the Pro and the O4 Lite finally is what you've been waiting for. What about the V2 goggle? There's a whole lot of people who are super annoyed that the O4 is not supported in the older V2 goggle. And the real question is, will it ever be supported? And MadsTech has said that technically there's no reason why it couldn't be supported. Maybe not at full performance. That's my editorializing, not his. Maybe not at full performance, but like there's no reason DJI couldn't write some code to make some backwards compatibility mode where it can operate with the V2 goggles, albeit maybe at reduced performance. But DJI hasn't done that, and I think it's fair to say that they probably won't ever do that. They're going to just let the V2s continue to sort of trail their way off into the horizon, and hopefully you guys will upgrade and spend some money, and that's just how DJI is. And there are some people who are like really mad about that and wondering why people like me aren't more mad about that. And I just think of the Aesop's fable where the scorpion gets on the frog's back and is going across the river, and the scorpion stings the frog, and the frog is like, now we're both going to drown. What the hell is your problem? And the scorpion says, it is in my nature to sting. And it is in DJI's nature to have a little bit of backwards compatibility and then not anymore. And anybody who's, gosh, those V2 goggles are like 6 years old, 5, 6 years old. Of course, DJI didn't support them in the O4. Like, I mean, you could be mad about it and wish they had, but like, obviously they were never going to do that. Frankly, I'm amazed that the V2 goggles got O3 support. And let's not forget that DJI still makes the RunCam Link and the Caddx Vista transmitters for the V2 goggles, which again, I'm astounded that they're doing that and actually can't explain why, but they do. So they're keeping the V2 goggles alive. They're giving you guys VTXs to use. They're not going to give you the O4. They haven't given you the O4, and I don't think they ever will. So be mad about it if you want, but it just is what it is. What about spectating? Which goggles can spectate which goggles or which air units? And the question about spectating is the same as the question about which of the RC controllers are supported. So the way it works is that you've got one group of goggles, which is the G3 generation, the O4 generation. That's the Goggles 3, the N3 goggles, and the RC Controller 3. And they are all compatible. The RC Controller 3 can bind to the G3 and the N3 goggles, and they can all audience mode or broadcast with each other. On the other side, you've got the Goggles 2 and the Integra and the RC Controller 2, and they can all work together. They can audience mode each other, and the RC2 can bind to the G2 and the Integra. It doesn't matter what air unit you're using. That formula is as I just described it. So if you've got an O4 air unit bound to a Goggles 2, you can use the RC Controller 2, but not the RC Controller 3. And that's true if you're using an O3 air unit. It's true whatever. It doesn't matter. Why is nobody testing the range of the RC controllers? We're only testing the video link. And the answer to that is that with the G2 and Integra and the G3 and N3, the RC controller link is piggybacked on top of the video link. So the RC controller binds to the goggles, and then the goggles transmit the RC signals over the same data link as the video to the air unit. The air unit then breaks that out and sends it to the flight controller. But the range of the control link is the same as the range of the video link because the control link and the video link are the same thing. So whatever the range of the video link is, as long as you have video, you have control. And when you lose video, you lose control. But when you lose control, what happens? Because some people know that if you lose your video link, the flight controller doesn't go into failsafe. The flight controller doesn't know whether you have a video link. It only knows about the control link. And so they ask, if the video link and the control link are the same thing, then if I lose video and therefore also lose control, will my flight controller know that that's happened and correctly enter failsafe, return to home, etc., etc.? And the answer to that question is yes, because when the air unit loses the video and control link, it also sends failsafe indications to the flight controller. So the air unit tells the flight controller that a failsafe has happened when the video link is lost and failsafe works correctly. Let's talk about using the O4 Lite on a 1S Tiny Whoop. And the first question we'll address is that the minimum voltage for the O4 Lite is about 3.7 volts. Under ideal conditions, like if it's only transmitting at 25 milliwatts and not pulling very much power, you can drop it a little lower than 3.7 volts, but not very much lower, and 3.7 volts is a safe number to use when you're doing your planning. So that means you can't run it directly off a 1S battery. And its maximum voltage is 13.2 volts, I believe. Good enough for a 3S battery, but not good enough for a 4S battery. So what do you do if you want to run the Lite on either a 1S or like a 6S bird? And on a 6S bird or a 4S bird or anything above 4S, the answer is pretty simple. You're going to run it off a voltage regulator, and your flight controller almost certainly has a voltage regulator. Now, your flight controller probably has a 5-volt regulator, and it probably, but not definitely, also has like a 9-volt or a 12-volt regulator. Which of those should you use? And the answer is that you should use the 9-volt or 12-volt, the higher voltage regulator, if at all possible, because the 5-volt regulator on most flight controllers is not rated. It's intended to run like your camera and your receiver and the flight controller itself, and not much more than that. Many flight controllers have a 5-volt regulator rated for just 1.5 or 2 amps. And the problem is that the O4 Lite pulls as much as 9 watts, which is 1.8 amps at 5 volts. So I would be hesitant to run the O4 Lite off my flight controller's 5-volt regulator unless I was very confident that it was a well-spec'd 5-volt regulator. Like iFlight flight controllers typically have a 3 amp 5-volt regulator. And it's truly, they truly like beef this thing up, and it can legitimately do 3 amps. I'd be okay with that. But if I had a typical flight controller with a 2 amp 5-volt regulator, pulling 1.8 amps from the air unit alone might put it over, and it would brown out, and my quadcopter would lose video and maybe fall out of the air. I would definitely want to test that rigorously, like set it to 4K 100 recording on board, transmitting at max power, 1200 milliwatts, whatever, 700 milliwatts, and like then see like if it overheats or drops out of the sky or anything weird happens. If possible, run it off the 9-volt or 10-volt, 12-volt regulator, and they'll avoid that whole issue. One of the complaints about the O4 Lite is the field of view of the camera. It's a relatively narrow 117 degrees, and it's usable, but number one, if you want to do stabilization, then you crop in even further and it's not usable anymore. And number two, especially if you're racing or doing proximity freestyle, you want a much wider field of view so that you can really see like, oh, that gate that you're laddering around or something, you can really see it. People have asked if you could make a wider field of view by changing the lens on the O4 Lite. And the answer to that is we just don't know. Is there a technical reason why DJI gave us this narrow field of view? They know we want a wider field of view. The field of view on the O4 camera and the O3 camera is ridiculously wide, wider than you'd ever want to use in reality, specifically so they can crop in for stabilization. So why didn't they do that with the O4 Lite? Well, maybe they wanted to keep the camera smaller and lighter, and so they gave us a worse lens so they could say it was 10 grams, 11 grams. And maybe there will be aftermarket lenses to give us a wider field of view. Usually with a camera, you can replace the lens and get a wider field of view. You just need the right lens. And I don't imagine that DJI will do that, because like historically DJI doesn't release like a different lens for users to retrofit to their Air unit. But historically users have found lenses that work, and it doesn't seem like it would be that hard to unscrew the lens on the O4. Is it even screwed in? Is it glued on? We just don't know. That's something that's in the maybe for the future. I don't think DJI will do it, but maybe there will be an aftermarket solution, and it seems like it should be technically feasible. Speaking of compatibility, people asked why the O4 camera isn't compatible with the traditional mounting of FPV cameras, and they asked whether the O4 Air unit is going to be compatible with frames that support the O3. Let me just give you the dimensions of these things, and then we can talk about compatibility. So the dimensions of the O3 Air unit is 32.5 by 30.5 by 19.5 millimeters. The O4 Pro Air unit is 33.5 by 33.5 by 13 millimeters. So it is 1 millimeter larger in one dimension, about 3 millimeters larger in another dimension, and actually thinner. So it's thinner by about 6 millimeters, but it's just a few millimeters larger. I think it's safe to say that any frame that will fit the O3 Air unit probably will fit the O4 Air unit. It's just not that much bigger, and most frames give the O3 at least a couple millimeters of spacing. In fact, the O4 is easier to mount on slam deck frames because it's 6 millimeters thinner, and you got a lot more room to like put your receiver on top of it or just get a battery strap through on top of it. But the O4 camera is significantly bigger than the O3 camera and doesn't fit on most frames that fit the O3. So the O4's dimensions are 25.5 by 20 millimeters wide by 23.3 millimeters tall. That's 25.5 deep. The O3 is 21.2. It is 20 millimeters wide, the same as the O4. So in theory, you'd think any frame that fits the 20 millimeter wide O3 would also fit the 20 millimeter wide O4, but it's not true. And the reason is, number one, the O4 is taller and deeper, and therefore there's not always room to like tilt it the way that you want to. But number two, the camera mounting holes are significantly different. They're taller, and basically just you need custom mounting for the O4, period, unless you're just going to tape it or glue it in. Not only do you need custom mounting, but the front end of many frames, the way it places the screw holes and the position of the camera forward and rear in the front means that even if you somehow manage to jam the O4 in with a 3D printed mount, it's going to be sticking so far forward that it'll stick out the front and it'll get damaged. Basically, the O4 camera is going to require manufacturers or intrepid 3D printers to design custom solutions for its mounting. It will not be a drop-in replacement in basically any frame. And by the way, the O4 Lite camera is 14 millimeters wide and can fit in basically any frame that supports a typical 19 millimeter standard FPV camera with a 3D printed adapter. But the O4 Lite camera is very small, bad field of view. The O4 Lite has worse latency, and I think people are going to be using that mostly in micro builds where the O4 Pro isn't an option. However, maybe people who want to save money would put the O4 Lite in a 5-inch, and if you were going to do that, a 3D printed adapter would be just fine. Someone just has to make it. So what frames support the O4 Pro these days? And the answer to that question is going to change rapidly over the course of the next few months. In fact, before too long, all frames will support the O4. They'll have a solution for it. But as of today, there are relatively few, and I want to call your attention to the iFlight Nazgul, which has been updated to support the O4, and the GPERC Vapor, which has been updated to support the O4. If you're interested in buying a new frame to support the O4, those two do it. They're not the only ones in existence, but they are two prominent ones, and they've got a bind and fly ready to go, so they clearly have a frame also that can support it. In addition, if you have Chris Rosser's AOS frame, then he actually has 3D printed camera mounts and antenna mounts that let you mount the O4 Pro camera in his frame without any other modification. This is one of the few frames that doesn't need any changes to the hardware, only needs a 3D printed solution to properly mount the O4 Pro camera. That's pretty cool. If you're interested in picking up any of those frames or any of the equipment mentioned in this video, I'll put links in the video description below to where you can pick it up. And it really means a lot when you click those links because they are affiliate links. And that means that when you click that link, and then make any purchase at the affiliated vendor, I get a little commission. It doesn't cost you anything extra. It just tells the vendor, hey, Bardwell sent me, and in exchange for that, the vendor gives me a small amount of money. It's a small amount, but it does add up, especially when you're buying expensive shit like the O4 Air unit. So please go down to the video description below, click those links before you go shopping. In fact, you could even bookmark the links and then just use them anytime you do your shopping. I'd sure appreciate it. What are some good 1S drones that you could fly with the O4 Lite? And I want to start by saying that I actually don't think the O4 Lite is light enough to really be good in a 1S drone. I think that a 2S 75mm is the smallest drone that is really going to be excellent with the O4 Lite on it. But some people really want a 1S drone because they just do. Well, here are my thoughts. And I do say thoughts. These are not recommendations. These are brand new drones. They really haven't been tested. They really haven't been reviewed. Some of them are formulas that have worked in the past, like the Happy Model Mobula 6, but oftentimes there's a new flight controller designed to support the O4 Lite with the step-up regulator, and there's a lot of variables here, and this is all very cutting edge. So here are some drones you could look at, but it's not exactly a recommendation. And we'll start with the Happy Model Mobula 7 O4. This is a 2S 80mm tiny whoop with the O4 Lite on it. The Happy Model Mobula 7 is a very well-established formula, and Happy Model presumably has done a good job with this one. We've also got the BetaFPV Meteor75 Pro with the DJI O4. This is, in fact, a proper 1S tiny whoop. It's a 1S 75mm though. And what does it weigh? Weighs 37 grams. It's a 1S 75mm weighing 37 grams. You sure you want a 1S? Okay. Good luck. And here's what my personal favorite choice would be, the Flywoo Flybee20. It's a 2-inch. It doesn't have prop guards and it's not a tiny whoop in the traditional sense, but it's going to fly amazing. Just don't crash it. Don't fly indoors because you'll mark up your walls and cut up your couch, but this thing's going to be an amazing little backyard ripper, or maybe indoor if you're a much better pilot than I am. And again, it's got the O4 on it, O4 Lite on it. What about low light performance? I've actually got a low light test that I'm working on right now. It's not ready to release, but I do have some results I can tell you. Here is the O4 camera. It is in an almost completely dark room, and it is set to auto exposure. Its maximum ISO has been set to the maximum allowable value, which if I remember right is 256,000 or something like that. Then we turn the light on and we see what kind of results we get. Now here's the O3 under those same conditions. The only difference is that the O3's maximum ISO is one stop less than the O4. I think it's 128,000. In addition, keep in mind that by default, all of these cameras only go to 6400 ISO under their auto settings, and you have to manually change that in order to let them go any further. Finally, here is the O4 Lite under the same conditions. And as I see it, in terms of just pure sensitivity, the O4 did the best. The O4 Lite did the next best, and the O3 did the worst. As far as image quality, well, we'll have to wait for the full video to judge that. None of them, though, have as good a low light performance as a proper low light camera like the Walksnail Pro camera, which just destroys them, okay? So if you really want excellent low light performance, you're going to have a dedicated low light FPV camera with a separate HD camera on board to get your good quality footage. How does the O4's image quality compare to a GoPro? Can you replace your GoPro with an O4? Well, the O4 is the best image quality we've seen yet from a DJI system. Now, is it good enough to throw out a GoPro? That depends on your needs. It is certainly not as good as a GoPro, especially as you get to the later generation GoPros. They've gotten better and better and better. GoPros have larger sensors, they have better dynamic range, and they just have better image quality overall. But I think a lot of people are going to be so happy with the image quality of the O4 that they're going to be willing to pass on their GoPro, especially people who maybe aren't doing a ton of color grading in post, although the O4 does have a cine mode that gives you sort of a flat color profile that helps with the ability to grade. I think a lot of people are going to be happy with what the O4 gives them. What about the ham unlock? It works the same with the O4 and the G3 as it did with the O3 and the G2. It works exactly the same. In fact, if you already unlocked your goggles previously, they're just unlocked. And then when you start binding your O4 Air units, they're just already unlocked. Once you unlock the goggles, it's just done forever. Unless you hard reset them, but I don't know why you would do that. Some people are having trouble activating their O4 Air unit. You need to download the latest version of the DJI Assistant in order to activate your Air unit. If you just use the same version that you've always had downloaded, it won't do it. It won't recognize it. What about low power mode? The O3 would not go to full performance even if you turned off temperature protection, and you needed a separate piece of hardware. If you didn't have a flight controller to tell the O3, hey, you're armed now, the O3 wouldn't go to full performance. You wouldn't get the full range, penetration, frame rate. It just wasn't at full power. With the O4, if you go into the settings control menu and you turn off the low power temperature protection, the O4 does go to full performance. So no more need for the O3 armor or anything like that. Sorry, Chad Rains. Chad Rains is the inventor of the O3 armor. There's not going to be an O4 armor. DJI got ahead of you. What about audio support? I like to hear my motors. I want audio. I think it's pretty clear that DJI isn't going that direction. Like, none of these Air units have a microphone. Ever since the V1. The V1 original DJI Air unit was the only one that had a microphone. Not a single one has had it since. And there's been no indication that DJI gives a shit about audio. So, Evan Turner came up with the idea of getting the DJI Mini microphone and putting it on your quadcopter and using that to transmit audio back to a receiver. And it only has a range of 400 feet or 400 meters. Doesn't have a great range, but maybe it would work. But there just isn't a good solution for audio. Sorry. What about video out from the goggles? Do we finally have HDMI out? And the answer is basically nothing has changed since the G2 and the O3. We can still get video out to the DJI Fly app if you want to get it on your phone. And if you have Cosmo Streamer, you can get video out to HDMI, Wi-Fi, or any network streaming. Cosmo Streamer is sort of a Swiss Army knife for getting video out of DJI goggles. I can tell you that my Cosmo Streamer with the O3 license seamlessly worked with the O4. So if you have a solution for the O3, it will work on the O4, whatever that solution may be. If you're interested in learning more about Cosmo Streamer, like how to make a Cosmo Streamer box for yourself, I'll put a link to my tutorial down in the video description below. That's really the way to do it for most people. You've also got the DJI Pro controller, which could do video out from the O3 and the G2, and presumably also works with the O4, just like Cosmo Streamer does, if you happen to already own that. But it's like $1,000, so don't buy it. Build a Cosmo Streamer. Heck, you can buy a Cosmo Streamer for cheaper than that. DJI video systems famously have a hard limit on their range, which means that no matter how many amplifiers you put on the system or how big of an antenna you put on the system, when you hit that limit, it just stops working. And this is based on some aspect of the protocol itself. It's not based on GPS, because the O3 doesn't have a GPS in it. The O4 doesn't have a GPS in it. But it's something about the protocol where when you get to a certain distance, the protocol just stops working. That distance for the O3 was around 23 kilometers. It varied depending on which exact hardware you were using. Under some circumstances, it was as much as 30 kilometers. I can tell you that very recently, someone took the O4 out to 25 kilometers. So the 23 kilometer limit is busted, and they had to turn around and come home because they were running out of battery. Maybe it's 30 kilometers. Maybe it's even more than that. We don't know. But we know that it's not 23 kilometers. And sooner or later, someone will take it even further out, and we'll see if there is a limit or if there isn't. People wanted to know what kind of range they could expect from the system. And I can tell you, you can expect to get more range than you did on the O3. But the actual range and penetration is going to heavily depend on environmental conditions and your willingness to push through low bit rate. The actual range for some people is going to be just a couple kilometers. Other people are going to go tens of kilometers. Depending on if you're flying in an environment with a lot of obstructions, maybe it'll be only a few hundred meters. It's just going to vary. But there's no doubt that the O4 is going to give class-leading range and penetration. It's going to be better than almost anything out there in terms of providing a usable, flyable image in adverse conditions. That's just what DJI is good at. Okay, let's talk to the iNav folks in the room. If you fly iNav, then you know that the DJI O3 didn't have proper support for the iNav on-screen display. It didn't support the iNav character set. So the iNav devs implemented a Betaflight compatibility mode where iNav OSD dumbed itself down, and at least you weren't seeing question marks on screen, but you weren't seeing the full iNav OSD. There was some hope that the O4 would support the full iNav OSD because in a pre-release version of the firmware that someone got hold of, it supported the iNav character set. And then when it was released to the public, iNav support was gone. And not just the iNav character set. The O4 does not work at all with the iNav OSD. In fact, the whole iNav MSP connection doesn't work. The O4 doesn't even know when your quadcopter is armed if you're running iNav. And the iNav devs have figured out what is broken and what DJI is not doing that they're supposed to be doing, but being DJI, they didn't care. They just did it the way they thought they should do it, and it works with Betaflight, and that was their goal, and they could have done it a better way, and it would have also worked with iNav, but they were just like, whatever, that's not what we were tasked to do. And the iNav devs are in the process of making a workaround. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can read this GitHub pull request. I'll put a link in the video description below, but the bottom line is that under iNav 8, you can type set enable broken O4 workaround equals on, and it will work again. Thank you, iNav devs, and F you DJI. Maybe DJI will fix it, but they didn't fix iNav support on the O3, so I'm going to guess they're not going to do it on the O4 either. Okay, that's everything. If you want to learn more about the O4 Air unit, including all of the testing that I teased in this video that isn't done yet, I've got a playlist. It's my DJI O4 playlist. I'll put a card on screen to that. And you can check out the other videos, test low light testing, range testing, race testing. Some of those videos haven't been released yet. So if you go look at the playlist and they're not here, don't be mad, but come back and check. And of course, keep an eye on the channel, and I'll see you there.